There are some developments on the Jets quarterback front. Was a trade between the Jets and Packers done for Aaron Rodgers? And then did things get complicated by the Pat McAfee show? We'll discuss this today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, April 14th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making this show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Then this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. And our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps, in the game. Well, surprise, surprise, we're talking about the Aaron Rodgers situation today as the Jets and Packers still have not struck a trade. There was, however, some news that was broken yesterday by Charles Robinson, a reporter with Yahoo Sports, who you may remember a few weeks ago actually had a few insightful pieces of information about where things stand. Robinson, in a media appearance yesterday, gave us some insight into how things potentially broke down between the Jets and the Packers right around the time Aaron Rodgers appeared on the Pat McAfee show. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, before we begin this, I will state the obvious. Reports are reports. We don't know the validity of them. We can never say with 100% certainty whether, something actually happened or not. Beyond that, I think it's pretty clear the Packers are playing the media game a little bit better than the Jets right now. It seems like the Jets are trying to keep this out of the media. They're not leaking anything. So take this all with a grain of salt. But we can only go on what's been reported, and I have no reason to doubt Charles Robinson. I think I have nothing that suggests to me that he would be wrong on any of this. So we can go through it and, again, keep in mind the perspective that it's possible that, things played out differently than is being told to him. But anyway, the news is somewhat interesting. And what he says is that the parameters of a deal between the Jets and Packers were done around the time Aaron Rodgers appeared on the Pat McAfee show. Now, you may remember, in the weeks leading up to that appearance on the McAfee show, it was not clear what Rodgers wanted to do. That's where he made his announcement. And it also was a point where the Jets and Packers were speaking to each other, because this is a deal that had and has many moving parts to it. So in the event that Rodgers did want to come to the Jets, the two teams were working to lay the groundwork of a potential deal. Now, what Robinson reported is that the deal had the Jets trading a second-round pick this year and a first-round pick, an unconditional first-round pick next year, to Green Bay for Aaron Rodgers. To me, that sounds like an awful lot to give up for a quarterback who, at most, is going to be here 2 years, and who has a really big contract, and who's coming off the worst year of his career, and who his current team doesn't want, and for whom there are no other suitors. So these are all factors that need to come into play. However, the report, what Robinson has revealed yesterday, is when Rodgers appeared on the McAfee show, he hinted at the idea that he was 90% on his way to retirement, and then kind of changed his mind because he was upset with more or less how the Packers had handled things. And that led Woody Johnson to question whether Rodgers would be here for 2 years. And I have to say, if this was any other owner in the NFL, I actually might doubt this report, because I would say, how silly can you be? Because it's not like it's a big surprise that Rodgers came close to retiring. It's not, even at the time, 2 years seemed like the maximum. But for whatever reason, it never occurred to Woody Johnson before that point that there's a realistic possibility, or at least if Robinson is to be believed, that it never occurred to Woody Johnson before that point that there was a realistic possibility that Aaron Rodgers would be there 1 year and then retire after that year. So that has apparently led the Jets to pull back their offer, modify their offer. Again, these are just rumors. I can't verify them. I can't deny them. But it does not really paint Woody Johnson in a great light, which I guess is not surprising. And it seems like Woody Johnson is kind of driving the train here. It seems like he's in charge of the whole situation. And Robinson has suggested that he is the guy who's now very hesitant for the Jets to give up a first-round pick. And I look at this situation and I say, it's almost like this is a case where two wrongs make a right, because the first wrong is I don't think the Jets should have considered giving up a first-round pick. I don't think the Jets should give up a second-round pick or a third-round pick, but definitely not a first-round pick because of all the factors I just mentioned. Rodgers is old. He's probably going to retire after 1 year. There are any number of nobody else wants him, including the Packers. I mean, this is there's supply. There's not a lot of demand for him. So giving up a first-round pick seemed like a pretty big overpay to me. Then the Jets reportedly pulled back the offer because it occurred to Woody Johnson after Rodgers' comments on the McAfee show that he was really strongly leaning towards retirement, and then kind of changed his mind because this told Woody that Rodgers may not be here more than 2 years, or more than 1 year, I beg your pardon. Now, I look at this and I say, you were expecting this guy to be here 2 years and you were giving up a second-round pick and a first-round pick? That's not a good package for a guy who's going to be here 2 years. But how you did not realize that Rodgers might only be here 1 year. I mean, everybody knew that. I knew that. You knew that. You knew that that was part of the risk. How Woody Johnson did not know that, I really struggle with. But it's a weird thing because, again, the first wrong was offering the first-round pick. The second wrong was not understanding that Rodgers may be retired after 1 year. Yet somehow these have kind of made a right because now the Jets are not putting a first-round pick on the table. So it's almost like the Jets handled this so poorly that they kind of ended up doing the right thing. So, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And I think in this case, if the Jets are probably going to get Rodgers, I can't imagine they're going to have to give up a first-round pick. So almost like two cases where the Jets were unbelievably poorly managed end up probably working out for them better. So all I can say is sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. So what Robinson has said is that the deal on the table right now from the Packers remains a second-round pick this year. The Jets have two of them now. They actually have back-to-back second-round picks, 42 and 43, and next year's first-round pick. But there is a bit of a contingency built in there where if Rodgers retires after 1 year, the Packers would then send back some sort of 2025 pick. So that's not that far. The teams are not that far off in what they want for the final trade package, because there were reports that the Jets were offering a pair of second-round picks a few weeks ago, and the Packers would give back a first-round pick. There were also it's not a first-round. The Packers would give back a third-round pick if Rodgers retired after a year. There was talk that maybe the 2024 pick from the Jets would be conditional on something like them hosting a home playoff game, which I don't understand why that would be the condition. I think the condition should be a Super Bowl. But if you read between the lines here, if you actually get through all of this, you get past Woody Johnson, whatever the heck he's doing, it doesn't actually sound like the two teams are super far apart. And as I've been saying for weeks now, there's a lot of posturing because everybody eventually needs this deal to get done, but nobody needs this deal to get done immediately. They don't need it to get done this week. They don't need it to get done next week, depending on how greatly the Packers and Jets value 2024 picks. It could conceivably go past the draft, although my guess is still this happens at some point before the NFL draft is over. But one of the big takeaways is this is very much a Woody Johnson project, and that much I think is fairly clear. I think if you've been following this really for the last couple of months, if you've heard Woody's comments himself to the media, it sounds like Woody is back on a very involved basis with this team, and he is driving the Aaron Rodgers negotiations, and somehow he's kind of gotten himself into a good place, and it's not really because of anything he's done well. It's just couple, like I said, two negatives make a positive, I guess, for the Jets. So I guess you take it. After everything we've been through the last 12 years, I guess any good news is something you'll hold on to. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will continue this Friday episode. We'll continue to talk more Aaron Rodgers trade. One of these days, we'll be able to talk about something other than Aaron Rodgers, but that day is not today. We'll continue on this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. We play Fantasy GM a lot on this show. We talk about what the Jets should do, what they shouldn't do. Well, now you have a chance to actually try your hand at being a GM for a pro football team. You've got to give this game a try, Ultimate Football GM. It's not as easy as you might think to create a dynasty, because when you play Ultimate Football GM, you get to control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory trying to build a historic dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, navigating all the finances, including negotiating player salaries and terms, managing your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, player personnel issues, and all the ups and downs of a season. And all this is in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. And to download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. We're talking about the latest in the Aaron Rodgers, Jets-Packers standoff. Charles Robinson of Yahoo Sports did a media interview yesterday where he broke down some of the developments, some of the reasons this thing has dragged on as long as it has, and we're heading to the NFL draft in a few weeks. The Jets still don't have their quarterback. The Packers still have Aaron Rodgers under contract. Both teams want to get this deal done, but they haven't been able to strike a deal yet. Now, other thing that Charles Robinson threw out there are potential parameters for a deal. Now, as I mentioned in the first segment, apparently what Green Bay wants now, at least according to these reports, is a second-round pick this year and a first-round pick next year. Now, the possible compromise that was floated by Robinson is the Jets giving up a third-round pick and a first-round pick. Now, that would be a little challenging because the Jets don't have a third-round pick this year. They actually traded their third-round pick to Cleveland as part of the Elijah Moore trade. The Jets sent Moore and their third-round pick for a second-round pick, so the Jets essentially moved up on day two by trading Elijah Moore. So that could complicate things a little bit. Now, these teams in the NFL, they use what's known as the Jimmy Johnson trade value chart. There was a guy who worked for the Cowboys who came up with the chart, who did all the hard work. His name eludes me right now, but perhaps there's some sort of compromise that the teams can make that it would involve the Jets trading down and the Packers trading up, and the value of the picks could add up to some sort of the value of a third-round pick going to Green Bay. I mean, I feel like that's what it's going to end up being. You know, if I had to guess, I think there's probably going to be some sort of creative solution at the end of the day on this. I think another possibility may be something along the lines of that pick the Jets got from the Browns in the second round, because, and I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be the centerpiece, but I think the optics of that are easy to digest for both teams, because if the Jets trade that pick to the Packers can go around saying, well, we got a second-round pick as part of this deal. Whereas the Jets, they can say, well, it's really just Elijah Moore, who we had no use for, and a third-round pick. And I think that's, I think at the end of the day, what you'll probably see is the teams develop some degree of creativity, and they'll probably try and figure out some way that they can both save face through this deal. And a pick like the pick the Jets got for Moore adds to the ambiguity, because for both sides it's kind of what you want. The Jets really did not give up a whole lot for that pick. They gave up Elijah Moore, whose time with the team had come to an end, who really did not have a future with the Jets, and they gave up a third-round pick. And not that the third-round pick lacks value, but to get a second-round pick, that's pretty good. But the Packers in return would get, obviously, a second-round pick. So for the Packers, it doesn't matter where the pick came from. It just matters that it's a second-round pick. The other factor that comes into play here will be whether or not there are conditions on a pick. And I think that could end up being the compromise. And you may remember back in 2008, the Jets traded for Brett Favre. The situation was a little bit different because it was in training camp and Favre was an enormous distraction for Green Bay. There were some things that are similar from the standpoint that the Packers did not want Favre anymore. The Packers had decided to move on to their next quarterback, who ironically was Rodgers, and now they're ready to move on from Rodgers to Jordan Love. And what the Jets did, the Jets essentially gave up a conditional pick to Green Bay, and what it was, I think it was like a fourth-round pick that turned into a third-round pick if Favre played like 70% of the snaps, a second-round pick if they made the playoffs, and the first-round pick for a Super Bowl. And that was a pretty logical step. And I think that at the end of the day, the Packers probably need to understand that it's unlikely they're going to get an unconditional first-round pick. The fact that if the Jets were willing to give that, then the best thing that ever happened was that Pat McAfee show appearance, because there's really no way the Jets should have even considered giving up a first-round pick for a soon-to-be 40-year-old quarterback who does not have much of a market and who has a bad contract you have to take on. I'll keep saying this stuff over and over because it's true. I maintain this. Like, this was, it doesn't make the Jets, it doesn't make Woody, I shouldn't say the Jets, I mean, this is Woody Johnson. It really does not make Woody Johnson look good, to that the fact that things transpired the way that they did, if that's true. Again, if the report's true. But it's for the best thing for the franchise. Sometimes it's better, sometimes you just need things to break your way. But I think that probably could be the middle ground, because when you make a pick conditional on certain parameters, the Packers could say, there's the old phrase, and you hear it in contracts all the time, this is worth up to, when a player gets a deal. Mecole Hardman got a contract worth up to $6 million if he hits all the incentives. And I would imagine what will happen at the end of the day is the Packers are not going to get an unconditional first-round pick. I would like the Jets to stay strong. I don't think the Jets are going to stay as strong as I want them to. So I think what will probably happen is there probably will be some sort of condition on that second pick the Jets send over. And what it'll probably be is it'll probably be something to the effect of it'll probably be similar to the Favre pick, where it'll be based on the team's success. Robinson has floated the idea that maybe it's going to be tied to the Jets hosting a home playoff game, which they have not done since 2002. But I think that it would be better if the only scenario I'd ever want to see the Jets give up a first-round pick in this deal, any sort of first-round pick, is if it was conditional on the Jets winning the Super Bowl, or at least making the Super Bowl. Because at that point, okay, fine, you trade a first-round pick for a Super Bowl, obviously. But there's still a lot to be worked out, and we'll continue to monitor the situation. There's actually some other news with the Jets, though. A punter who has a rather infamous role in team history will be leaving the team. The future was kind of clear when the Jets re-signed Thomas Morstead, but Braden Mann's on the way out, and we'll talk about Braden Mann and his legacy as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. Let's talk punters now. We've talked enough about Aaron Rodgers. Let's talk about punters. And the report came out yesterday that the Jets are waiving Braden Mann, the guy who's been their punter the last 3 years. The Jets failed in their efforts to trade him, and I really don't know why the Jets were. I mean, did people get bored? Were people in the front office bored? Did they just decide to call around the league as a joke or something like that? Were they looking to hear the reactions? It's like, you get kicked out of your fantasy league the next year. You don't get invited back to your fantasy league with your friends next year if you start making trade requests like offering Braden Mann for something. I can't imagine why the Jets did that, but apparently the Jets were calling around asking if anybody was interested in trading for Braden Mann. Shockingly, nobody was interested in an inconsistent punter who really has not been very good for the Jets. There were. I shouldn't say there were lots of people who were excited, because I don't think a lot of people were excited. But Mann did have a pretty good scouting report entering the league out of Texas A&M. It just never panned out for him. And you go back 2 years, he got injured in that first game against Carolina. It was unfortunate, but the Jets signed Thomas Morstead. Morstead was great with the Jets, and Mann returned. And even at the time, I kind of questioned the move, because you were getting rid of a guy who had been better than Mann was only 1 year into his NFL career, but he still was not as good as what Morstead was producing as the punter for the Jets. And I understand Mann was younger than Morstead, but punter's not really a position where youth matters. You can always find another punter. You're not really developing a punter. You're not bringing him along slowly like you might with a receiver who needs to work on his releases from the line or his route running. On some level, you can either punt or you can't when you enter the NFL. You're not really going to. I'm sure there are guys who have improved after their rookie season. I'm sure there are technical things you can work on, but it's just too easy to find a punter to really invest too much into trying to develop somebody, because it's not worth it. You can find another punter available pretty much anywhere. That's what the Jets did in 2021 when they signed Thomas Morstead. So what happened this offseason? Well, the Jets kind of, I guess, made up for their error. They brought Morstead back, so Thomas Morstead now looks like he's going to be the punter with Mann out. What's Mann's legacy with the Jets? Well, first of all, I think he was a bit of a disappointment for a late-round pick, but Mann will be the trivia question for a long time in Jets lore. You may remember him in that game in 2020 when the Jets beat the Los Angeles Rams. That it was their first win of the season. They were 0-13 entering the game, and they were in pole position to draft Trevor Lawrence. And the Jets got off to a phenomenal start. The Rams kind of were sleepwalking through the first 35 minutes of the game. Then the Rams kind of turned it on about halfway through the third quarter and were mounting a comeback. And with late in the fourth quarter, Braden Mann made a touchdown-saving tackle on a punt return that saved the game, and the Jets ended up getting a stop. They ended up getting their first win of the season, and they lost out on Trevor Lawrence and ended up with Zach Wilson. Now, to be fair, there's one caveat. The next week, the Jets also did beat the Cleveland Browns after that Rams game. And had the Jets beaten the Rams, had the Jets lost to the Rams, and had they beaten the Browns, so even if they had lost to the Rams, that win over Cleveland also would have knocked them out of the Trevor Lawrence pick. But who knows how different things are in that situation. We do know the Jets got Zach Wilson, and we do know that Braden Mann had a pretty indistinguished career with the Jets, and now we look forward, I guess, to the Thomas Morstead era, if a punter is allowed to have an era. But I think Thomas Morstead's the better choice. I think he was the better choice 2 years ago. I think the Jets made a mistake not moving on from Mann, and I think that they've kind of remedied that. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.